The house had smelled like cinnamon and pine, and for a moment, it almost tricked me into believing the morning would stay gentle. I arrived at exactly 10:00 a.m., carrying my apple crisp and gifts for my grandchildren, and the small suburban rituals of Christmas seemed intact: the soft music, the eager hug from Emma, the careful cool of teenage Jake masking his smile, my son's warm embrace, and Amanda's bright, practiced welcome. We opened presents, the children animated with their new games and clothes, and I moved into the kitchen to help with the feast, as I've done for decades. Only there did the facade slip. My dish was missing from the counter. Amanda had tucked it into the pantry, accompanied by a casual note that store-bought was easier and that tastes change. It was the tone that lodged under the skin, not the logistics. I had spent hours the day before baking a dessert that has threaded through our family memories, and I asked that it be served. Her mask fell. Her voice climbed. My contribution became evidence in an indictment that had clearly been building. She listed my interference, my reorganization of groceries, my comments about structure for Jake, and finally, the accusation that my gifts, particularly money, were strings disguised as generosity. I stood listening, startled by how neatly she had cataloged every ordinary gesture into proof of control. I tried to explain that I was attempting to help, but my words dissolved. Dinner resumed under a brittle calm. When dessert came, Amanda told the table I had not brought apple crisp. Jake, certain he had seen it in the pantry, asked to have some. She cut the question off, declared that adults decide what is appropriate, and steered the evening back toward her chosen order. I could feel the pattern I had missed for years: invitations shrinking, excuses multiplying, my presence curated to the margins while my wallet remained central. I washed the dishes beside her afterward, and finally asked what was truly happening. She answered with the possessiveness of a person guarding territory. This was her home, her husband, her children. My role would be limited and tidy if she had anything to say about it. It was cruelly honest and strangely clarifying. If my presence had become a tax paid for my financial help, then it was time to change the equation. I collected my coat and the untouched apple crisp, kissed the grandchildren, and told Brian I was thinking about adjustments in the new year. On the drive home, I took the long route through glowing neighborhoods, and by the time I set my teacup down on my own kitchen table, I had decided to calculate not what I felt, but what I had paid. I made a list without sentiment: every loan, every emergency transfer, every gift that wasn't small enough to forget. The total surprised me. My quick tally reached $43,000, and when I called the bank the next morning for copies of checks and reviewed my statements with my advisor, the figure climbed past $67,000 over 5 years, once we added direct vendor payments, deposits into their account during crises, and the gift cards I had purchased for the children that Amanda always offered to deliver. The ledger told a story more blunt than hurt feelings. My love had become a revenue stream. The money wasn't the catastrophe. My retirement was modest but stable. The wound was dignity. I realized how often I had reframed isolation as generosity, telling myself that crumbs of attention were closeness, and that enabling someone else's control was keeping the peace. That evening, Brian called repeatedly. When I finally answered, he framed the day as an overreaction on Amanda's part, that we could sort out if we just talked. I asked if he had any sense of the total I'd contributed. He didn't. When I gave him the amount in words, he stalled, then searched for a way to make it less stark. Even then, he spoke as if Amanda's distress, rather than deliberate manipulation, explained the police call that would come moments later. Because as I finished my accounting, a no-nonsense officer sat in my living room and asked whether I had made any threats. Calm felt like armor. I told her what had been said, what I intended going forward, and handed over my ledger. She took notes and told me plainly that she saw a boundary dispute, not a criminal threat. When she left, Anger arrived cleanly. It was not the frantic version I had kept at bay for years, but a steady heat that simply refused to accept unacceptable treatment. As I sat with that heat, I noticed an old question waking up. Why did I know so little about Amanda's past? She had always been vague about work, college, and former addresses. I had accepted that vagueness as privacy. That night, curiosity aligned with discipline. I began searching public records, and soon I found a civil case file against an Amanda J. Mitchell, 28 years old, in 2014, accused of embezzlement and quietly settled. The dates matched her arrival in Brian's life. The detail that unsettled me most was not the accusation, but the pattern implied by her precision around money in our home, the way she controlled accounts, narrated pressures, and insulated our connection to the grandchildren while maintaining a steady conduit to my bank account. I needed observation, not rumor. The next afternoon, I drove to their street and watched from the anonymity of my parked car. A boutique furniture truck delivered a dining set that looked extravagant. And later, I saw Amanda return with armfuls of shopping bags from luxury stores. It was the day after Christmas, and the picture contradicted the story of unbearable financial pressure. When Brian called from work, I asked whether she had the day off and whether the children were with friends. He said yes, casually, as if the household were humming along. Then I asked how often he and Amanda had discussed the total of my support, or the invitations I no longer received. He stumbled, reached for the one example at hand, this Christmas dinner, and went quiet. The shape of our dynamic came into focus. He had built a habit of smoothing edges around Amanda's decisions, running diplomacy between reality and her rules. I understood then that any change would have to start with me. That evening, I returned to the search and followed a breadcrumb I had missed. The name Mitchell had a history in the Denver area, and the embezzlement case I had found was not an isolated whisper, but a curtain tugged open. When the phone rang with the detective's voice on the other end, identifying herself from the financial crimes unit and asking about my interest in that name, my breath still caught. She told me that my search activity had intersected with an ongoing investigation. The woman I knew as my daughter-in-law had used multiple identities across a decade. Married men with steady incomes, centralized control of household finances, and disappeared after extracting everything she could. In 2 marriages, she had left stepchildren behind when vanishing no longer served her. The detective believed my grandchildren were biologically my sons, but the rest of the pattern, she said, matched. I drove to the station the next morning at 9:00 a.m. and sat across from a file with Amanda's photo clipped to the front. The detective showed me surveillance photos, bank visits, a storage unit, a second car registered under a different name, and evidence of a secret apartment. They had been building a case and needed proof of active fraud. My records and a controlled opportunity could provide it. They asked whether I would help catch her in the act. I agreed, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the truth to be undeniable and the children to be safe. The plan felt simple on paper and delicate in practice. I would meet Amanda for coffee in a public place. I would offer an early inheritance $200,000 framed as a tax-efficient family gift that required account details for proper transfer. If she were acting in good faith, she would immediately suggest bringing Brian into the conversation. If not, she would try to route everything through herself and reveal the shadow network running under the household budget. Detectives would record the exchange from nearby tables. When I called, she sounded surprised, but agreeable. At the cafe that afternoon, I led with an apology for overstepping at Christmas, told her I had heard her words about boundaries, and explained that I wanted to help without hovering. I laid out the gift with the exact constraints the detectives had crafted. I needed current account numbers, routing details, balances for documentation, and confirmation that the accounts could accept immediate transfers before the end of the tax year. She did not hesitate. She said she managed all family finances because Brian's job consumed his time. She provided not only joint account details, but also 3 additional accounts under names I did not recognize, plus an investment account and a business account for a consulting company she had never mentioned. She promised she could prepare everything quickly. I thanked her for the path to a quieter future between us. As I walked to my car, the detective called to say they had what they needed. The extra accounts were under false identities, and one had been receiving regular transfers from the family's joint account, matching withdrawals I had seen on my statements. Early the next morning, they would move. That dawn felt like a long exhale. When Brian called later, his voice shook. He told me Amanda had been arrested and that officers were saying her identity was not what he thought. In the quiet that followed, all the small confusions of the past years rearranged themselves into a pattern that finally made sense: the narrowing invitations, the carefully curated warmth, the precise control of stories at the table, the calculated police call meant to paint me as erratic and keep me compliant. The children were confused, of course, but protected by the ordinary tasks of their day and the steady reassurance of familiar adults telling them that love would remain while other truths were sorted. I sat with a reheated slice of my apple crisp and realized that for the first time in years, I felt neither beholden nor erased. The days that followed were full of paperwork, statements, and the painstaking labor of placing facts where feelings had once done too much work. I gave the detectives my ledgers, bank copies, and a timeline of every transfer. They explained what charges might stick across jurisdictions: fraud, identity misuse, financial exploitation. They told me what they could about the sealed cases in other states and where cooperation would be necessary. I called my financial advisor again and froze habitual transfers that had seemed harmless when I believed they were helping with braces or mortgage gaps. I spoke with an attorney who walked me through boundaries that should have existed years ago, not to punish my son, but to protect my own retirement and ensure help would be transparent if ever offered again. I wrote a letter to Brian, not to litigate the past, but to describe the future. I would no longer offer emergency funds. I would not participate in any arrangement that hid numbers or bypassed voices, and any support for the grandchildren would go into accounts they would access at adulthood with proper oversight and documentation. I told him I loved him and that love would not pay another bill. He read the letter and cried, and even that grief felt like a beginning rather than an ending. The detective called to say that Amanda's second car had been recovered and that the storage unit contained items consistent with the planned disappearance: pre-packed boxes, duplicate documents, and a tidy ledger of account balances. She said that victims of financial predators often describe a slow erosion of clarity, a reality fog that lifts all at once when the pattern reveals itself. I recognized the description instantly. I had been explaining my way around facts for years. The children asked to visit me that weekend. We played cards and ate the apple crisp that had been declared inappropriate for a holiday table. Emma asked whether tradition mattered only when it served adults. Jake asked how to tell the difference between generosity and control. I told them that love respects the person receiving help, that love doesn't buy silence, and that a family grows stronger when everyone tells the truth. Even when it shakes the room, they are teenagers, and the words will probably land slowly. But at the end of the night, Jake asked for a copy of the recipe, and that felt like a quiet amending of the record. I met once more with the officer who had first visited my living room. She told me that the initial police call had, ironically, hastened accountability by placing the conflict in a documented frame. I thanked her for listening without condescension and for asking precise questions that allowed facts to breathe. She reminded me that boundaries often sound like threats to people who profit from boundaryless environments. I kept that sentence. It explained not only the explosion on Christmas Day, but the unease that had haunted smaller interactions for years. In the weeks that followed, the house in Denver quieted. The new dining set stayed, but became a monument to decisions made in a fog. The shopping bags were gone. The second car stayed in impound. Brian went to therapy. He called not to ask for money, but to ask how I had rediscovered steady ground. I told him the truth. I stopped paying for my place in a family I already belonged to. I opened the blinds on what I did not want to see. I allowed anger to do its clean work and then gave it a job: build a boundary, not a wall. I started small rituals that weren't substitutions for a missing family, but affirmations of a life not on hold: morning walks at 7:30 a.m., an afternoon phone call with an old friend, a weekly class at the community center where I learned to glaze pottery, and a habit of writing down 3 things I had chosen for myself each day. My finances steadied. My heart did too. When the district attorney called to outline the likely timeline months rather than weeks, I felt only patience. Justice does not hurry to soothe the victim. It moves at the speed of evidence. Meanwhile, I visited the children and returned to my quiet apartment and baked just enough for the people who showed up because they wanted to, not because they were paid to pretend. I thought often about the line that began all of this, a blade disguised as a holiday greeting, and how easily I had once mistaken performance for peace. Peace is quieter. It holds eye contact. It doesn't require you to forget yourself to earn a seat. When I finally told this story aloud, I did it for the person I was on Christmas morning, and for the many people who have sat at tables where kindness is choreographed around a grudge. I said that love without dignity is not love, that generosity measured in secrecy and resentment is a poor bargain, and that it is never too late to renegotiate what you will trade for belonging. I said that elders do not need to audition for their families, that grandchildren can hold 2 truths at once, and that a son can grow again after complicit silence if he is willing to face himself. Most of all, I said that the best revenge is the refusal to be anyone's victim, because that refusal frees you to act without pettiness. By the time the charges formally landed, the outcome mattered less than the fact that the pattern was undeniable. Amanda faced consequences shaped by jurisdictions and statutes. I faced a mirror I could meet without flinching. The family calendar changed. Invitations expanded again, but this time with transparency. When I brought the apple crisp to a simple Sunday supper months later, Emma set it proudly at the center of the table. Jake had baked a second crisp using my recipe card, and the 2 dishes sat side by side. A small proof that tradition is not an idol to be worshipped, but a language families use to say we remember who we are. I drove home that night at 8:15 p.m., the streets dark and ordinary, and felt an uncomplicated quiet settle in. The lesson I carried into my apartment was not about villains and heroes. It was simpler. Strong boundaries are a form of love for yourself first, and then for the people who need you steady more than they need your money. If this story reached you, let it be permission to reclaim your dignity without asking anyone to hand it back. Thank you for staying with me. If you found something meaningful here, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, subscribe for more stories, and tell me in the comments what part resonated most